Alright, so when is funny not funny? That's the question I want to pose today. Comedians often will use offensive and shocking routines to entertain their audience, and many of them have great success doing this. But are there some content or some ideas that should only be looked at in a serious context? That are some things that should only be taken seriously? Ronald Sousa once said, "Like monarchs, we sometimes license fools to tell us truths which our friends will be too well brought up to speak." And a lot of these comedians would be those fools, but they're not fools at all. They're just people that don't conform to the rules of society. They don't worry about offending people, and that's why we license them as fools, because when they put things in a comedic light, it makes what their content easy to disregard as just offensive. A lot of people say that there are some things that shouldn't be funny, but what they really mean is there's some things they don't want to talk about. The Amazing Atheist, in his 666 video, just entitled 666, he talks about people and how they're oftentimes offended by his jokes and not the subject matter that the jokes are referring to. And the more offended by that, by a joke, the more likely it is them to have that hypocrisy in them. I mean, a lot of times if somebody's offended by a joke about poverty, you'd think that they would do all that they can to end poverty in America, if not the rest of the world. But it seems to me that more often than not, those people that are offended by those jokes about poverty don't really do too much to stop that. They just don't want to be told that there are poor people in the world and that they're not one of them. I mean, this is the same idea George Carlin brings up with his 7 dirty words that you can't talk about on TV, which are shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits, sometimes fart, turd, and twat. He talks about these words that you can't say on TV, and it's kind of ridiculous why people are offended by these words. I mean, sticks and stones will break your bones, but words will never hurt you. Well, of course, when you can hurt somebody by saying something to them, but it's not the words themselves that do that. It's the idea behind those words that'll hurt somebody. And even if you tried never to offend somebody, you would still end up offending people, because that's just how people are. But Richard Dawkins had this to say about being offended at a presentation he did at UC Berkeley. He said, "I'm offended by things. I'm offended by chewing gum. I am offended by backwards pointing baseball hats. But I don't try to get a version of blasphemy law passed to prevent people from chewing gum or reversing their cap. So what if I'm offended? So what if my feelings are hurt? Does that give me the right to prevent others from expressing their opinions? And we don't have the right to not be offended, nor should we. I mean, being offended can oftentimes be a good thing. It can help us realize that there's that hypocrisy in us, and once we realize it, maybe we can overcome that hypocrisy. But there are some people and ideas that when we make fun of them, it's not to try to change that person, or it's to use them as example. And I mean, I think pretty much everybody out there can think of somebody that if something bad happened to them, we'd laugh at them and wouldn't feel bad about it. I mean, even as long as what happens to them isn't drastically worse than the negative things that they've done, we can find it funny, and it's not wrong to try to hurt them with comedy, as long as we're not trying to do it with violence. The Nez Perce Indians in northeast Oregon, they used to punish people in their tribe for breaking the tribe's rules by laughing at them. They would form a gauntlet of people that the person would have to walk through, and they would just laugh at them. Now, I don't know how well that's going to prevent that person from breaking the tribe's rules, but I think it can definitely help other people that are watching this to realize that to help them point out to those people that what that person did was wrong. And I think that's definitely something that comedy can do. But the Amazing Atheist also talks about that in the video that I mentioned earlier. his former landlord who tried to jack up an RV with a car jack, which was a stupid thing to do. The RV fell on him, crushed him, and killed him. He said he didn't really find it all that funny because he knew that person, but if it was just somebody else that he didn't know, he would have found it hilarious. And the question he poses there is, does him laughing at that person diminish that person's life or that person's death? And he didn't think it did, and I think he's correct in assuming that. And like he said in that video that it helps. Comedy can help people overcome those things in life that they can't really overcome, like death or stupidity. And a lot of times we can't overcome our stupidity. It's just we have that in us. Everybody has some stupidity and they've done stupid things, but we can laugh at them, and that helps us overcome them. And overcoming hardship is definitely something comedy can help with. An interview with Chuck Palahniuk in Playboy, he talks about after a reading he did of his short story Guts, a woman came up to him and told him a story about when she was a young girl, she had a stomach ache, and her mother put like this vibrating hot pad on her stomach, and it kind of slid down in between her legs, and it got her off at this young age. And she showed her Girl Scout friends this, and they all ended up having their meetings over at her place, and they all were using that vibrating hot pad. And her mom walked in and caught her, and with all her friends doing this, and called her made all the girls go home, and called her like a little whore and all these other terrible things, and beat her. And this girl, who's now a woman, hasn't had an orgasm since that day. And Chuck Palahniuk talks about it says that he thought this was just this horrible thing. But the woman said, well, if you can tell that story Guts, then I can tell this story and make it a hilarious thing. And Chuck Palahniuk said that this is her way of using this horrible thing to her advantage and not being used by it. And that's something that comedy can definitely do. That if there wasn't that comedy there, it would just be this horrible thing that happened to her, and she wouldn't be able to use that. But still, even with these positive attributes of comedy, are there some things that we just should not joke about? I mean, let's take, for instance, Michael Richards' rant, where he ends up calling some black people nigger and saying that 60 years ago they would have been hung upside down with a pitchfork up their ass. Can we condone that? I think most people would say that we can't. I mean, even he apologized for this afterwards. But the interesting thing about that, I mean, of course he could have been just apologizing to try to save his career, but at that point it didn't really matter. He was just like the rest of us. But the interesting thing I should say about that is during his rant, people weren't laughing, but when he apologized for it, people were laughing. And what this says to me is that that laughter is ridiculing him, and it's using him as an example of how not to act. And whether there was intentional or not, I mean, clearly it wasn't at that point. He was ridiculing himself. So how do we determine right and wrong in comedy? Because clearly this Michael Richards, what he did was wrong. But how do we judge that? Well, I think it's the same as any other moral decision. I mean, there isn't any objective morality that we can adhere to, so it's all subjective morality. So it has to come with us. So that, of course, raises the question: well, how can we condemn something as wrong when it's just our subjective morality condemning it? Well, I think if enough people have the same ideas for morality subjectively, then it becomes a quasi-objective morality. And if we condemn something like Michael Richards' rant as morally wrong with our quasi-objective morality, then it becomes wrong for all intents and purposes. It takes on that status of being wrong. So, when is funny not funny? Well, I think funny is always funny. If somebody finds something funny that, even if it's against that quasi-objective morality, it's still funny to that person. It can point out things about them that they might not like, or that others might not like about them, but I think when it points those things out, it can help that person and the rest of us learn from it. I think there's definitely something to be said about being offended by something and not pushing it away, and still learning from it. This is what comedy can be, I think, and it's how we should try to take comedy. And it's what I think it would be the highest kind of morality and what comedians should be striving for. This is Roland DT19. Thank you for listening.